It happened 55 years ago today. This was the day in 1964, February the 9th, 1964, the Beatles were introduced to America. I'm Scoot, and welcome to the scootontheair.com daily hit. We talk about the top stories of the day. We talk about interesting things that have happened. It's an interesting take on news stories of politics and pop culture from the perspective of a registered independent, a maverick moderate who does not care what either political party thinks. In fact, this is an honest assessment of some of the issues and topics of the day. Also, we welcome you to Scoot on the Air YouTube. And if you have not yet become a member, we're now over 150 subscribers. It's free, and we just give you an update every time something happens. And we've got some really great interviews on there and some great videos as well. So let's get to today. It's February the 9th. It was on this day 55 years ago the Beatles first appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. They played 5 songs. The first song they played was All My Lovin'. I remember as a kid watching in my den at my home in Metairie, Louisiana, suburb of New Orleans. And I remember that there was this big thing about the Beatles. In fact, it was really my grandmother who told my mother that we had to watch this, that there was this new phenomenon. And my grandmother had lived in Beverly Hills for a while, and she was very savvy when it came to the stars and pop culture. And so she was the one who actually told us we had to watch. So we watched, and I can honestly tell you, I don't remember specifically why I thought it was so different. I mean, I knew it was different. I guess I don't know why I thought it was so special, but I knew that moment was special. I mean, I was a kid. I didn't really know what to think, but I knew it was different. And I knew it was something that reflected my generation, the baby boomers. And I remember my dad just thought it was a joke. I mean, he said, "That's not really music. They're only playing 3 chords. They're not really singing. It's just a passing fad." Well, my dad was wrong. And so were a lot of people of the establishment. The Beatles endured. And to this day, this is what is so amazing about the Beatles. To this day, the Beatles have not only continued to capture the baby boomers that they were first introduced to 55 years ago, but they have younger generations, millennials, Gen X, Gen Y, who love the Beatles, who have discovered the Beatles. Much of the music of the Beatles spoke to all these different generations to the point where they are Beatle fans. And they're not old enough to remember when the Beatles first arrived in America. It was crazy. You know, that Ed Sullivan Show, the population at the time in America in 1964 was 192 million people. 73 million tuned in to watch the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. And that was long before social media. So even before social media, we as humans knew how to spread the word. And the word got out. 73 million in a nation of 192 million. Today, our country is about 340 million. So 73 million tuning in today would be huge, but not even as big as it was in 1964 because of the portion of the population that was. It's less of a portion of the population today than it was back then. The Beatles were truly a phenomenon. And, you know, a lot of people don't know this, but, you know, the average Beatle concert was about, I don't know, 20 minutes. Yeah, I mean, their songs were short. They came out, they did all their songs, and they were off. That seems unheard of today, but it's true. When you look at pictures of the Beatles today, you think, well, you know, their hair really wasn't that crazy. I mean, they really weren't that wild. I mean, listen to their music. It's really not that wild. It's not like today. Well, this is the big mistake that a lot of people make, because in the context of 1964, the Beatles were as outrageous with their hair, with their clothes, with their sound. They were as outrageous as artists and bands are today. You could take the most outrageous artist today or through time, and that's how rebellious and outrageous the Beatles were when they hit in 1964. Because you can't judge things outside of the context of the times in which they occur. So the Beatles were really quite a phenomenon. The other thing to consider is that the Beatles arrived on television in America. They arrived in America like 2 days ago, but this was the first appearance on television. That happened 55 years ago in 1964. The Beatles were done by 1970. They were done, broken up. A lot of rumors as to how or why they broke up, but they were done. So in 6 years, think about what this group, this single group, gave in terms of musical diversity. I mean, they started off with the simple love songs. I Want to Hold Your Hand, All My Loving, She Loves You. Those simple songs. I Saw Her Standing There. Those were some of the early songs the Beatles played on Ed Sullivan. They started out with those simple songs, and then they evolved. Drugs had a lot to do with their evolution. The Beatles gave us Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, a complete departure from what they first established 55 years ago today. It was a theme album, and they had actually become Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Just absolutely brilliant, a concept album that was, at the time, was unheard of. And after that, there was Magical Mystery Tour and the Beatles album, often known as the White Album. And there was I Am the Walrus. And it just, again, so much diversity in music, so much different types of music in a very short period of time. I've often wondered if the Beatles were overrated. No, they weren't. There was something really special about that band. And here in New Orleans, every summer, excuse me, there is a Beatles Fest at the House of Blues. Sells out every year. And there's a broad range of demographics there. How do you explain that? How do you explain 20-something people being part of a sold-out Beatles Fest at House of Blues? Well, it'll be sold out again this year, 2019. How do you explain it? You can't. The music was that good. As songwriters, Lennon and McCartney were that good. There were so many little interesting idiosyncrasies about the Beatles. A lot of people joked that Ringo Starr was not really a good drummer. Well, I had a conversation with Rob Schulte, who's drummer of one of the top cover bands in New Orleans, the Top Cats. Well, really, this part of the country, the Top Cats. Rob's a great drummer. And I was kind of joking with Rob at Beatles Fest one year. I said, well, you're playing drums, but it's got to be pretty simple because, you're playing the drums that Ringo played, and Ringo wasn't a very good drummer. He goes, well, he says, Ringo was the perfect drummer for the Beatles. Because Ringo, with his drums, he didn't try to take over the song. His drumming was perfect for the Beatles. And also there were some interesting things about Ringo Starr because Ringo Starr was left-handed, but his drums were set up for a right-handed drummer. But with his left hand being the lead, that led Ringo to coming up with riffs and little things that he did that were different. Because ordinarily a left-handed drummer would have his drums set up left-handed. So that was another thing that made the Beatles unique. And George Harrison certainly had his impact. He was, I guess many would say, the quiet Beatle, but he certainly had his impact on the Beatles. They were brilliant. And I can't imagine that anything like that would ever happen again. Times were simpler. Things were different. There were only 3 networks on television. It was easier for one band to get so much attention. The next time there was a real departure in music was in the early mid-90s with the grunge sound, alternative music. And I noticed, in doing my radio show, I noticed talking about the establishment who was saying, that's not really music. They're only playing a couple of chords. They're not really singing. And immediately I thought about, that is exactly what the establishment said about the Beatles. Except this time, with grunge, the establishment was the baby boomer generation. They heard their parents say that about the Beatles. And I thought, this is a real interesting moment in time when you've got now a generation that is saying the same things about a change in music that their parents said about a change in music back with the Beatles. And like the Beatles, there was an anti-establishment appeal to grunge. In fact, it was the anti-establishment sentiment in young America, the children of the baby boomer generation, that caused that great departure in music in terms of the sound, the fashion. Everything was anti-establishment. And it was a new young generation. Again, ironically, the children of the baby boomer generation, they were saying, we don't trust the establishment. We don't like the establishment. We don't like you. We are different. And we're going to show you how we're different. I want to go back to the Beatles. The Beatles were as lucky as they were talented. That doesn't take anything away from their talent. But when the Beatles hit American television 55 years ago today, that was only 3 months after the assassination of President Kennedy. And it was the assassination of President Kennedy that I think set up Beatlemania, set up this phenomenon of the British invasion, set up the anti-establishment generation. I mean, think about it. You know, baby boomers' parents didn't talk to them like parents talk to their kids today. If it was the news, they assumed we weren't watching. They never thought we were paying attention to the news. I guess they thought they were sheltering us by not even talking to us about that. But as a young generation, we knew what had happened. We didn't really know what it all meant. But at least subconsciously, that created a serious crack in faith in the establishment. Because we watched our parents' reaction to it. We watched the world's reaction to the assassination of the president. And even though we were young, we realized that the president is the leader of the establishment. He was murdered in public during a parade. That created an enormous crack in a young generation's subconscious faith in the establishment. So the seeds for the anti-establishment generation were planted when President Kennedy was killed. 3 months later, the Beatles arrived in America at a time when a young generation was looking for a way to show that they were different. We don't want to be part of the establishment. We're different. We're going to show you we're different. We like things you don't like. So it was timing that helped this whole phenomenon. And it was an amazing time in America. And, drawing the parallel with the grunge movement, the sound and the fashions, the grunge fashion, the flannel shirts tied around your waist, the pants, the Doc Martens, all of that. That was a rebellion against the establishment, because if you think about it, that young generation was told, well, you can't have sex because of AIDS. You can't do this. You're going to die from this. Yeah, I think the baby boomer generation, the parents of those people who got into grunge, I think my generation painted a very negative picture of life. And, my generation was getting divorced. So kids were from broken homes. And young people lost faith in the establishment. And boom, this angst-ridden sound came from bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden. And it went from a cult following to mainstream America. And it hit mainstream America because this is what young people were feeling. It answered their angst. It answered their desire to say, wait a minute, we don't trust the establishment. We are different, and this is going to be our signature. This is why I often refer to myself as a hostile witness to the baby boomer generation, because in so many ways, my generation doesn't get it. So egotistical from the beginning of their inception that they don't even see what they've done wrong. I'm proud of some things in my generation, but my generation is very, very hypocritical. My generation is very self-centered, and they do no wrong. It's these kids today. Well, the kids today are doing the exact same thing you did, or we did, and it's hypocritical to not acknowledge that. So, I hope these have been some interesting thoughts on what happened in America 55 years ago today when the Beatles first appeared on American television. It was the beginning of a phenomenon. But there's more behind it than just the Beatles. It happened in the context of the Kennedy assassination. It happened in the context of a young generation wanting to rebel against the establishment. And then I saw distinct parallels in the early and mid-90s with the popularity of grunge and how different that was. That was so different from what the Beatles and all the rock music, all the pop music that had been established since the Beatles. It was all different, but it was still based on the same concept of music. And it was grunge that really changed things. And that was from the children of the baby boomer generation. So I thought, that was interesting. I'm sure you have your favorite Beatles songs. We all do. It's hard to say that you have a favorite. But the Beatles really, contrary to what my dad thought, and many people who were part of the establishment then, the Beatles were great songwriters. And they did great music. In fact, the song that was named by Rolling Stone magazine as the best song written is from the Rubber Soul album by the Beatles. The song is In My Life. There are places I remember. Some have gone and some remain. Some for better, not forever. A brilliant, brilliant song. So the Beatles, it started 55 years ago today, but they certainly made their mark on America and the world. Thank you for being part of scootontheair.com. We do the Daily Hit every Monday through Saturday, somewhere about 9 or 10 New Orleans time. And it's a take on what's going on that day. Sometimes it's about a controversial issue. You can go back and see some of the videos. It's all on the website. And if you go to the website, scootontheair.com, right under the main picture there's a bar that says daily content. Just click on daily content. You'll get the latest daily content. Plus, you can scroll down and take a look and see if you're interested in any of the other things, including some interview shows, some great interview shows. And we've got more interviews coming up. We're also on Scoot on the Air YouTube, and I hope you will become a subscriber. I'm Scoot. Have a great weekend.